Today, Steve and I are going to talk about our writing processes when it comes to writing comic books. I don't think that either of us would call ourselves experts, but we are experienced professionals. And I know that I personally want to impart some of the things I've learned over the years to new writers in hopes that you won't have to jump blindly into writing comics like I did. I like to call what I did jumping into the deep end and then learning how to swim. Things would have been a lot easier and less mistakes would have been made had I known some of this stuff beforehand instead of just figuring it out as I went. But that said, as of this recording, I have personally written 12 comics, six of which are published: Omen number one and number two, Gallowsman number one and number two, Dragon Girl Albino Warrior number one, and Satyr number one from Revelation Comics. I've also scripted four comics, and one of those is published: Insurrection Fox Operation Book One. That was also from Revelation Comics. I'm also currently writing six titles. I did take writing in college, and I have some experience writing prose, but nothing that has been completed. How about you, Steve? Could you tell us a bit about your writing experience and what you'd like to do today?
Sure, I'd be glad to. Now, I don't have quite as many comics in my name as Mike does, but I've done quite a few issues of White Druid and Michael Nero and Guardians of the Lamb for Omen, as well as Blitz for Revelation Comics. There's also the upcoming Blood World by Raincross Press that both Mike and I have done scripts for. In terms of prose, I've also done the short story Blood and Ashes for ASAP Imagination, which is a post-apocalyptic fantasy tale. I spent a long time reading about how the process is for different writers and figuring out how to make it work for myself. However, my professional background is in academia, and I've done graduate level study in writing. I've also taught writing on the college level for years, so this is kind of shop talk as well within my professional wheelhouse. So what I plan to do is get into my own process and how I do it, but also share some things I've learned along the way. Before we get started, though, I feel like I need to preface this discussion with a couple of things. Firstly, what we're going to share is how Mike and I write comics. We're not offering these methods as the only way to do it, or the definitive way to do it, or anything like that. Nobody can guarantee that. Not even the best writers or the best writing teachers. I mean, everyone arrives at the writing process a bit differently. And what works for us may not be what works for you. That's okay. The trick is to find the techniques that do work for you and then refine your own process to sharpen that as much as you can. But if we can offer you a few tips and they work for you, then that's great. Absolutely. Work with that and see where it takes you. The other thing is something I constantly have run into when teaching writing, and that is self-belief. A lot of writers start off not knowing if this is the thing they can do or if they can even learn it. The answer is yes, you can, but you have to work at it until you get better. You're going to write a fair amount of bad stuff at first. That's normal. Neil Gaiman has said a few times that you have to get the bad writing out of your system before you can get good stuff. That's how you learn. You learn the technique, you make mistakes, you improve, and you see where you stand by then. I'll also add as an aside that sometimes an inexperienced writer can do things that more experienced pros wouldn't, and that can lead to happy accidents. So take those leaps and see what happens. I mean, take risks. The confidence will eventually come, but you have to go through that rough patch first. So, go ahead and be patient.
Well said, as usual, my friend. I know I wrote like three comics before I started to get any good at it, in my opinion. There was definitely a learning curve in there. And as Steve said, you can't be afraid to take that leap. I may not look back at those first few comics fondly, but I would not be where I am now as a writer had I not taken those chances. Also, if I may comment on something you said, Steve, you may not have written as many comics as I have, but you started off at a way better spot than me. White Druid and Michael Nero number one is really good, especially for someone's first comic. You inspired me, and I learned a lot from what you did there.
Oh, why, thanks. I appreciate that. I think some of that comes from the fact that I wrote a lot of fan fiction before I started into writing comics, which, by the way, is totally an acceptable way to do it. I also studied a fair amount of proscripts, the kind that tend to be included in trade paperback extras, and that helped as well. Not to mention that I've read books on writing comics, and that helps offer some grounding. So even if you don't have a ton of experience writing in the format, there are ways that you can prepare yourself until you're ready to dive in.
Totally. That is great advice. I absolutely wish I had taken some time to do some research on it before I dove into writing comics. So I would definitely recommend going Steve's route on that one. But let's get into my writing process. For me, writing comics is a series of steps. The first step is the story itself. I personally tend to start stories at the end and work my way back to the middle. That process helps me determine what characters I'm going to need to tell the story and build the world I need to happen in. A lot of times I'll have characters that I've already created or scenarios that I've been thinking about. But I also watch a lot of movies and I get a lot of inspiration and ideas from them. I'm talking about learning about storytelling and structure from watching how a story is played out and the way it builds up to the end with movies I've seen many times. This doesn't necessarily work too well with a movie you're just starting out watching, but on multiple views you can get a good idea of how they're setting up the story there. Um, for instance, though, I had been brought on to Raincross Press to write a story inside the Blood World universe created by David Howard. I had read what David had written as far as the universe and the people and places in it, and I had been thinking about what kind of story I could write in that universe. One day I was rewatching Blade Runner 2049, and the idea for a sci fi noir story set in the Blood World universe suddenly fell into place. I blended this idea with other concepts I had floating around from my favorite neo noir horror, Seven from 1995, and the universe that David laid out, and I had the end of my story. I can't go into more detail than that as far as the story itself, but I mention it to give you a feel of the process.
See, this is what I'm talking about when I say that individual writing processes work a bit differently. Mike is a lot better at planning things out long term and being incredibly detailed in his approach to writing comics. That's just not the way I do things, though. I think it often helps to have his narrative structure when I work on Nero or Guardians. I mean, Mike's sense of detail helps me know what I'm working towards and lay seeds towards what we're building to. So even though I'm not that kind of writer myself, I can appreciate that method of doing things. But I tend to be a lot more freewheeling on my own concepts, and I usually plant story points that I need to go to while leaving characters room to surprise me, because they usually do. That way I know where I generally need to go while allowing for happy accidents along the way. In most cases, I need to know what my basic story is first, and then I start building around that. So for Guardians, I started out with what Mike gave me, which is the idea of several people in Roman era Jerusalem who go through time and space and fix the broken timeline. So I had my starting setting and I had the concept at that point. So from there, it was just a matter of knowing who my characters were and how they all got involved. More specifically, it was a matter of knowing who my main character was. So I came up with the idea that it was Saint Longinus, and he was chosen because he caused the whole mess, really. So I built the character of Marius around that idea, and then I developed the other Guardians from there. With Blitz, it was a bit different because that was in the works for many years. In that case, I had the core characters first because I created them for a superhero RPG. The character dynamics gave me what I needed in terms of concept. An idealistic, inexperienced young heroine working with a reformed villain who was cursed to do good. I had to build a new world around Roland and Amy while keeping the important elements of their backstory intact. So I drew on influences like Astro City and Top 10 and others, and I spent many years building Centennial City and the main elements that became the Blitzverse. I probably wouldn't take that approach today, but I was a lot less experienced at the time, and I was still feeling my way around the writing process. But I knew I had a lot to say about these characters, and I wanted a way to explore them. Sometimes just having the right character will lead you to the idea that you need.
We actually went through a similar situation with the Omenverse and the Blitzverse as far as both of us were still feeling our way through the writing process when we started out, as you said. Plus, we both had pre made characters we needed to fit into a new world. We went at it a little differently, but had the same task essentially. I think that further emphasizes your point about there being many ways to go about doing what we're talking about.
Exactly. Every universe goes through its growing pains at first, especially if you're still trying to figure out the ropes. That goes for character as well. So, although I know we've talked about our characters before, why don't we talk about the creation process in the context of creating a series?
That sounds like a good idea, Steve. Once I have established the ending as well as what characters I will use and how, I go back to the beginning. With the end in mind, I establish backgrounds for those characters that I need and want by choosing the most ideal setting to get that character where I need them to be at the end. For instance, while I can't tell you why because of spoilers, I can tell you that with Patrick O'Leary, I needed him to be a serial killer with supernatural powers, but well educated and highly trained in military weapons and tactics. Last but not least, I needed him to be insane. So I asked myself, what could make someone go insane? And I had heard that one bad day could break a man and make him go mad from the Joker. So I turned that up to 11 by giving O'Leary a series of bad days and even weeks in his life, with the idea that if one bad day could break a man, a dozen or more could shatter him, and then he would have to rebuild himself. His journey of self discovery and growth would make for a good character arc. Then I combined those elements with the Omenverse setting to create the background for O'Leary, as you see played out in Gallowsman number 1 and number 2, and as you'll see fully fleshed out in Gallowsman number 3. For me, had I started with just the character, I would not have known what all I needed him for in the story, and he would not have been so fleshed out. I have to have a goal in mind to write a story and to make character arcs. There has to be somewhere I'm trying to go, or the story and the characters could be aimless as I try to figure it out as I go. One of the things that I can do that makes this process easier for me is I never stop creating characters or looking for new ideas. Had I not been working on characters for a while anyway, the process of creating the Omenverse would have been more difficult. My advice, if you plan to create a universe, is to have as many loosely created characters in your arsenal as possible. What I mean by loosely is that they cannot be so rigidly made that they will only fit into one setting. Leave some wiggle room to adjust them. But again, we're sharing what works for us and our process. Having that stuff already is what works best for me. It can be done without having an arsenal of characters already, as my friend Steve here is about to talk about. In fact, he has a fair amount of experience, far more than I actually, in working and creating characters in someone else's sandbox. So, what's your process like, Steve?
My approach to characters usually depends on what I'm doing with them and what the story needs. Continuing with the Marius example, I knew that he was our version of Longinus, so I drew on the few details I could find out about him. So I knew he was a centurion, and he was the one with the spear in the side of Yeshua. But he was also someone whose blindness was cured by the blood of Yeshua. So the way I adapted that was to say that Marius's blindness was metaphorical, not physical. He was blinded by his loyalty to Rome, which led him to doing terrible things in the name of the empire. So Yeshua takes the blinders off of Marius, and his arc in Guardians is about who he becomes now that he's realized his previous wrongdoing. And then there are just times when a character jumps into a story and it's a complete fluke. Blitz initially wasn't even meant to be the main character. That originally was her sister Miranda, who you see in the first issue of Blitz. I envision Amy as a supporting character in a walk-on. I mean, just someone you could play Dawn and Miranda's Buffy. But then Amy spoke so much to me and took on so much life that she started taking charge and directing things. By the end, I knew she was the lead and the viewpoint character, and I see her as pretty much equal with Roland in terms of where the story needs to go.
I think that is definitely something different about our methods. As I already have the end in mind when I start, there's little room for being surprised by a character. I have to say that while I don't think I could do things differently, I can really appreciate the idea of things being more fluid. And honestly, one of my characters surprising me sounds really fun. There seems to be advantages in both of our processes, and that is something to consider if you're listening to this. Maybe what we do will work for you, and maybe it won't, but more than likely, there is a path that is just yours and with its own advantages and disadvantages. There is no perfect way that is universal, but think of it like MMA. Individual styles are made stronger by their combination with others. Weaknesses can be covered, and strengths can be more spread out.
Be water, my friend, as Bruce Lee would say. But that's
Yes.
right. And I think our collaborative nature of comics allows us to create a stronger whole from different parts. That's certainly true. But when thinking about characters, and especially main characters, there are a few things you should work out. You need to know what motivation is driving your character and why they're doing what they're doing in the story. So I'll throw out some examples from the characters that I use. Michael Nero is looking for an intellectual challenge and a distraction from the crazy things that the third site is showing him constantly. Marius is looking for atonement and a way to repay the debt that he feels he owes to Yeshua. Blitz is an idealist who wants to earn the respect of her sister. Eleutheria from our D&D campaign wants to wash away the sins she committed as a drow cleric of law, but she also wants a higher purpose, social acceptance, a place to belong. It's good to have different layers of motivation so you can put those drives in conflict from time to time.
Motivation is absolutely important for your characters, but not just what motivates them, but also how they acquired said drive or motivation. It not only helps to establish personality, it allows for a natural fit into the story. When a character isn't motivated or driven by a need, desire, or belief, then there is no connection between who they are and what they do. Patrick O'Leary, as I mentioned before, is a man shattered in a thousand pieces. He has no idea what he even looks like as a whole person anymore because all he sees are fragments of himself and his past. Patrick does what he does because he is broken and desperately trying to put himself back together. My D&D character Bjorn was taken from his family and people and forced into a life he did not know. His one connection to them is that a seer from his village told him that he was destined to become a great and legendary warrior. He is entirely motivated by that destiny and does all that he can to attain it because it is the one piece of his family and people that he has to carry with him, something akin to fulfilling the dying wish of a loved one. Your character has to get from point A to point B in their character arc, and their motivation and drive is the vehicle that is going to get them there and what will determine the type of roads that they can take.
Absolutely. And it's definitely an important point to know why their driving purpose is important to them. Nero is forced to cope with a power that he can't easily control and that many people don't understand or even believe in. Marius comes from a long line of soldiers, and he grew up believing that the Roman concept of honor. Eleutheria spent years running away from her past only to have it catch up to her, and she's also had to make hard moral choices that turned her away from vengeance. Amy lost her father to circumstances that even she doesn't fully understand, and she feels she could have saved him if she'd only been a little bit faster. Another thing to consider is what flaws your characters have and what weaknesses you can exploit in them. Michael Nero is a jerk, and he's got self-destructive urges that always tempt him, like his 7% solution that he uses to drown out the third sight. Amy is an impulsive thrill seeker who doesn't think before she acts. Roland is secretive and manipulative, and he's got dark secrets that he's ashamed of. Marius tends to trust too easily and follow people blindly. Those flaws can also be small things you can have fun with. I mean, for instance, Eleutheria has serious PTSD from her time in the Underdark, and that gave her a deep-seated fear of spiders. I like to confront characters with their worst character traits, fears, and the things that they don't like to deal with. You can come up with some pretty stories just from exploiting those weaknesses.
Perfection is boring. What's worse is that it can actually make it harder to love the character in the long term. I mean, sure, a reader might like a perfect character for a while, but believe it or not, and no matter how weird this sounds, while things being just the way we like it is nice, it's really only nice because the bad things are there to compare them to. Flaws can be endearing in a way. Achievements and success in a character mean all the more when there are flaws and difficulty to overcome. A character's struggle through weakness makes their strength all the more powerful when they overcome them. And for humans, at least, the less struggle that was involved, the less value something has. Things that are easy to achieve, things that are easily attained, have considerably less value than what was worked for and struggled through.
Oh, totally. The whole point of telling these stories is to have our characters change and grow from their experiences, and that's hard to do when they have nothing to learn. So we're totally agreed there. Also, when you're building characters, you need to think about how much you have to bring to the table. If you can't identify or relate to a character, you're going to have a harder time in writing them or making them interesting. That sometimes is hard for me when writing evil characters, I fully admit. So I have to go the extra mile with certain villains or characters like Patrick O'Leary. Yeah, you're going to have to get to know yourself, both the good and the bad, and then work those elements into your characters. For example, is much like the impulsive person I used to be when I was much younger. Nero tends to be blunt and snarky, and I admit I do have a streak that deep down. Alternately, you get character traits that you like and admire, and you connect to that. But there needs to be something of you in the characters you write. I mean, that's what gives the spark of life in each of your characters. Just make sure you know the differences between you and your character as well. Identifying too much of any character can cause problems if you're not careful.
I think we are the opposite when it comes to characters we are better at. I tend to do best with villains, and even the heroes I create are severely broken 9 times out of 10. Um, this is because I often find villains to be more interesting than the heroes, if for no other reason than the effect that they have on the hero. But you can hear more about that in our What Makes a Good Villain episode. I have a Cartesian slant on the 3 act structure you might find interesting. But as far as parts of me and my characters, there definitely has to be some of that. I think that you have to have some perspective that you can both see, even if, like in Steve's case with Amy, that thing is something from your past that allows you to understand them. For instance, I do not share gallows man headsman's lust for guilty blood. However, I do share his respect for order and rule of law. Or Hangman, who feels like the outsider and the gallowsman. I feel like an outsider even among close friends. These things allow me to understand what the characters are thinking and feeling in any given situation.
For sure, you need to know at least who your main character and your antagonist are, but with some books, you need to work out a supporting cast or even a team. So I want to talk briefly about that in my own process when it comes to figuring out what characters to include. With Druid and Nero, I knew I wanted characters for them to interact with. Some of them I had out the starting gate, like Detective Pennywise, which made my job much easier. I needed Nero to have a contact in the police, but who could also be something of an Inspector Lestrade, a basically good cop who is both impressed and frustrated with Nero. Pennywise fit that role perfectly. But I also knew that Nero was a detective who got information from the dead, so a ghost contact made sense. And I love westerns, and this was California, so I decided that would be a dead cowboy. And that's where Bloody Shane came from. I love the idea of a dead outlaw poltergeist who hates detectives but needs Nero because he has no other solid connection to the living world. Colin came in because I studied a bunch of Irish myth to prepare for writing Lou, and I just love that Lou's son was a legendary Irish hero. So I figured that would give Lou someone to connect with and give Nero some conflict. The family connection is a big part of the series, and Colin and Nero as brothers of a sort seemed interesting to me. There's also another character I added because I felt like she'd make sense and add another dynamic to Nero than what we'd seen to date. I'm always on the lookout for interesting characters that you can offer a new and fascinating dynamic with leads. If they're not adding something interesting to your mains or to your story, then why are they there? You want to focus on what's interesting about your main characters and avoid dragging down the cast with unnecessary date weight, if at all possible.
I'll be honest. When I started writing, I had no idea about the value of what I call story real estate. I thought you could put scenes in stories just because they were fun or cool without any real effect on the story. So when I started writing my fantasy novel, The McPhear Family Chronicles, I had scenes that would go on for pages that might have added some character flavor at best, but did nothing to advance the story. So I was very wrong. I was particularly wrong as it pertains to writing comics, where every square inch of the page better have a point. But I'll get more into that when we talk about the addition of the artist and the letterer to the writing process. For now, suffice it to say that if a character is in the story, they need to have value in the story. If they are going to add flavor or background to your main character, then that flavor needs to affect the story or explain an action or thought process in the main character somehow. And the more layers you put on it, the better. For instance, the Angel Roselle in the Omen comics. I needed a character to introduce Frank Wade to Shakur and sell him on the idea of taking up the Omen armor. I knew that Frank Wade had come from a military family and that he had a strong sense of duty and a great respect for fellow soldiers and a heart for the plight of those wounded or lost in the battlefield. I also gave Frank a desire for redemption, for the lines that he had crossed that there is no turning back from. I gave all of that to Roselle and made the Omen armor about achieving that redemption. Because I needed that weight, that bond to carry the story of Frank taking up the Omen armor to be believable and to instill a sense of duty about it in Frank. But we've spent a fair amount of time talking about characters and character building. Why don't we shift gears over into world building?
Sure, but I want to make a quick point first. It's absolutely fine if you have a scene or an idea that you think is really cool and you want to introduce it in some way. But it needs to serve the story and the narrative you're trying to tell. If you can make that idea or scene work, great. It just shouldn't come at the expense of the larger story, and it should make sense within the context of the story that you're telling. It sounds like your process matured and you realize that economy was more important, and I think that's the right way to look at it.
I totally agree, and I did not intend to make it sound like working those things in so that it works for the story was not okay. I was trying to talk about the scenes that had no relevance to the story or to the characters. So thank you for clearing that up.
Oh, no problem at all. And that sounds fair to me. But to get to your question, I want to touch on world design because you need to know your setting at least to a reasonable degree. With the Blitzverse, I wanted a world that was like our world on a service level, but had noticeable differences once you dig deeper into what's going on with it. So it was not a 9/11 event. My feeling was that superheroes would have stopped that kind of thing. Where things go badly is a different event that occurs much later, which brings the end of Freedom Agents, who or the Blitzverse's main pro superhero team, like the Justice League or the Avengers. But I wanted a world that had a Victorian age and a pulp age, and then a transformation to the kind of comic book history that you'd recognize. But there are also weird characters lurking in the shadows, secret societies of immortals, other dark elements that are influencing events behind the scenes. So once I know where the breakpoints are from our world, I like for the consequences of those choices. I needed reasons for why Amy and Roland would be able to operate in Centennial City. So my thought was that there are rules for how superheroes operate, but they're deliberately not being enforced because there haven't been enough heroes to keep the super criminals in check. So that creates tension as well. Because if the heroes push the government too far, they might rethink that policy, and then it'll be harder for the heroes to do their jobs. So oftentimes you're thinking of the social consequences of whatever fictional ideas you introduce in your world. I also want to say that I've been fortunate to be able to carve out my own mini settings within the established worlds I write. So with the Omenverse, that's been the Guardians and the supporting characters I've built around Michael Nero and Luo Shi. But I've also done that with the Blood World book that Mike and I are involved with. In that case, I designed the asteroid belt, focusing on areas like Ceres. I wanted a space western type of environment, so I created a weak republic on Ceres and a space station called Persephone, which is controlled chaos in practice. So there are corporations, mercenary corps, and large empires that are all vying for control of the valuable resources in the belt. That allows for all kinds of adventures with a bit of Western flavor while also keeping with the harder SF elements that everyone else has been doing. I try to do the same thing with my Omenverse projects as well. I don't want to introduce anything that isn't true to Mike's visions for those titles if I can help it. So, Mike, did you want to mention anything else?
Steve covered a lot of the same points I consider as well. So I'll talk about the parts of the world building process that I use that he didn't mention. Let's talk about the Omenverse, for instance. I was inspired by the Blood Moon Tetrad in 2014 and 2015. For those of you that don't know what that is, a Blood Moon Tetrad is when you get a blood moon every 6 months for 2 years. People were talking about it being some sign of the end or a bad omen and that the apocalypse was coming. The idea occurred to me that there are many apocalyptic beliefs throughout the world. I pictured what would the world be like at the end of multiple apocalypses happening simultaneously, not just the aftermath of it, but who would the players in such an event have been, and what was the journey to this dark end like? I had several characters already that helped shape what the Omenverse became. But as I mentioned earlier, I started at the end of the story. In order to have multiple apocalypses, I figured you would need multiple gods and demigods as well as humans to bring it about. There is more to it than that, but that is at least one of the reasons I combined mythologies, folklores, and religions from around the world because I needed them to be there in order to get the end that I had in mind. Then, once I have the basis for the world and the purpose for the characters, it is about putting the pieces together. This is not a quick process. There are all kinds of logistics to work out as far as how the world functions with the parameters that you set. A key part in making a believable world is that it has to feel lived in. I chose to make the Omenverse centered around a fictional city called Kingdom City, and to flesh it out, I imagined the various settings and cities I have lived in over the years, which it is admittedly a lot. I knew that the city had to have a backbone, something that the city was built around. So I placed the city on the California coast and put a major harbor in it. With the major harbor, I could fill the city with international businesses. And while I knew I would need a couple of corporations to do what I wanted to do, that led to the type of corporations I chose to make. There had to be zoning districts and neighborhoods that accounted for all economic classes. I won't go into every detail, but I think you can get the idea of what I'm talking about. Basically, your city needs to be more than just a place that your characters are. It needs to be somewhere that they live. What I mean is that it needs to function and work like a real city. It is details like this that add to the feel of a location and the believability of the setting. You'd be amazed by the subtle detail that can be added when describing a setting to your artist when the location is not just a background. But now that we've talked about the characters and the story, let's start getting into actual producing comic. And the first place to start is a good outline. So why don't you talk to us about that, Steve?
I'd be glad to. I expect Mike has a different and more detailed approach when it comes to outlining stories. I'm a bit different in this respect. I tend to go with paragraph length summaries of what I want to do with each issue and then build a larger arc with that. I know Mike and I use a more detailed process when it comes to the Omenverse, so I'll let him talk about those titles. But with Blitz, I tend to do season arcs where I have larger stories in mind at the end of the season and then smaller arcs leading up to it. I generally have a main villain in mind for each season, and then I build up to the heroes confronting that villain's plan in some way. I'll then assign smaller stories in the middle as they fit and where it makes sense, or just introduce little things here and there that I want to do. Again, I try to leave room for characters to surprise me, but I like to have key moments that are consistent. Mike, I know your process is different, so did you want to describe how you do it?
Sure, Steve. What I do is outline the whole story using bullet points that I elaborate into paragraphs. I highlight all the key points in the story, how they happen, and what effects they have on the characters in the story. I want it to be absolutely clear when I reread the outline that I know exactly how to get the story where it needs to go and its effect on the larger story. While I do a further, more detailed outline of the individual issues, the bullet points are often paragraphs that give a description of what happens in the individual issues. I will typically write some type of small character or story arc, some resolution or story advancing discovery into each issue. So when I do the story outline, I will often add what that arc is. I like to do it this way because it allows me to see the story as a whole. This perspective often provides a way for me to tighten up the story and to do a better job at planting seeds along the way with the visuals and dialogue and narration. Plus, this outline works as a kind of Bible for the series. But let's get into outlining the individual issues.
Cool by me. I'll be honest and make an admission though. I actually don't do a lot of story outlining for individual issues. I usually do that when I plan out the season arcs in very brief terms, but I don't plan out every little thing that happens in a comic before I write it. Part of the reason is that when I'm in the moment, my characters will often flip the script on me, and so I feel like I'm wasting my time when I do that. I will do detailed plot outlines for novel projects, and I usually make adjustments when changes happen there. But for comics, I usually know the issue needs to end, and then I just guide the story there in the process. That said, I'll usually include a research phase around this point for certain titles if I need to do that. It's one thing to generally know what needs to happen, and then it's a matter of just getting the characters there. But sometimes I need to know specifics when I'm actually in the moment of writing. That happens a lot with Guardians, for example. I need to know the ins and outs of the setting I'm playing with. I mean, I can have fun and go wild with a setting like Camelot. But for something like Rome and Jerusalem, I need to know certain hard details. I need to know what the buildings look like, where things are, the kinds of terms that Romans would have used at the time. Sometimes I'll address research things if they come up while I'm writing it, but other times I need to figure it out before I start writing, and this is generally when I approach those problems.
I do a fair amount of research in the initial world building and character creation stages of making a story. But like you, I tend to leave the finer points for when I'm actually writing it. Just as an example, I might write that Nero needs several books on a particular topic in the story outline. But when I do the issue outline, I will list what those books are and maybe what he is getting out of each one specifically. Or I might have said in the story outline that the cops shoot at a character, but in the issue outline, I will look up specific weapons and their effects. I mentioned that the bullet points I make in the story outline are basically generic descriptions of what happens in the individual issues. Well, a lot of time I just copy and paste the bullet points from my story outline onto the page I'm going to write the script on. And then I elaborate the crap out of that and that generic description for the issue in the bullet point. I specifically detail the story and character arc that I've outlined for the issue, and I write out what happens in the individual scenes in the book in detail, even adding dialogue and other aspects that will end up in the finished script. In essence, I write a comic, but I do not out script it. I lay out the story that I want to tell. But then we get into actual scripting of the comic, which is a whole other ball of wax. But why don't you start us off on that one, Steve?
Sure thing. Like I said, a lot of my writing process is in the moment, and I tend to be in the zone when I work. Because for me, it's about getting into the heads of the characters and being able to see how they will authentically and honestly respond to the situations I drop them in. I feel like the characters need to be real at all times. So I usually let the interactions feed the drama in each issue as possible. From there, I know what I need to establish, and then I guide the characters to the endpoint I have in mind for the issue. The thing I always try to remember, though, is that I'm writing each script for an artist first. I want the story to be understandable to the audience, and I'll always try to make that clear in the script directions and in the dialogue and the narration. But first and foremost, I'm writing for my artist because I want that person to get my vision for the issue. In the case of our books for Omen and Revelation, that means I'm writing for Taza Nawashika. Very often, I'll be more detailed in my script notes, and I'll include specific references when I have a particular visual in mind because I need them to see what I'm seeing in the key moments. I also try to play to what I know are Tazan's strengths as our working relationship evolves. I know Tazan is very good at drawing buildings and environments, for example, which is very good for scenes in Centennial City. He's also very good at Kirby-style dramatic poses, which is really good for Blitz. He's also good at getting the visual historical elements down, be it uniforms or weapons or anything else. That's what I lean into with Guardians of a Lamb. I also know what to avoid, but my focus is finding visual elements Tozen is both good at and enjoys drawing because I want him to be engaged and on board with what we're doing. When I find a character he likes, I like to include them as well. Now, if I have any real struggles in that process, it's usually trying to get everything to fit the page count we've set for ourselves. There was an issue of Druid and Nero where I had to leave things out or move them to the next issue because I just couldn't fit them all in. Some of that stuff may find its way into later issues or into side projects like Dark Oracle, so you may still see it because I know I want to fit in as much as possible, but I need to balance that against pacing and including the most vital details for that issue to work. I also need to balance the individual issue against the needs of the longer term arc. So you'll have to make some hard choices about what to keep and what to ditch. Of course, it helps to have Mike and people like our editor, Russ Pierzek, to help me make those decisions when they come up. Mike, was there anything you wanted to add?
There is actually. As I have written out the unedited story in the issue outline, the next step is actually scripting the comic, and that is actually an involved process. There are several things that have to be considered with each and every page, and most of them involve accounting for the artist and the letterer's work in the final project. And I'll tell you right now that I had no idea about this when I first started writing comics. My focus was on what I wanted to see on the page and not the logistics of actually being able to do them. And God bless them. Our artist Tosin Awasika and our letterer Guido Martinez made the best of what I gave them. But I did not understand what I call page real estate either. Here are things I consider when writing out the scripted pages. Is there enough room in the panels to draw everything I want to see in them? And is there enough room for the lettering to be legible, to be a legible size and not cover up the artwork needed to tell the story visually? This involves considering both how many panels are on the page and what I need to have happen in each one. I personally tend to over budget the space required so that the artist and letterer have plenty of room to work. It's actually one of the reasons my comics tend to be so long. I keep the panel count down so that the panels can be larger, so that my artist has creative room to wiggle with the panel layout. Typically, I won't go over 5 panels on a page if I can help it, and I will never go over 6 panels. As far as the lettering goes, I use what may or may not be an antiquated standard for the word counts on a page. I say that it might be antiquated because it is the standard given to Alan Moore by Karen Berger when he was working on Swamp Thing for Vertigo, and that was obviously decades ago. So take this as you will. The total amount of words on the page is not to exceed 210, and there are not to be more than 25 words per balloon or box. Just to break that down a little, for 6 panels, that equals 35 words per panel. With 5 panels, it's 42 words per panel, and so on. Once I have the whole unedited story written out in this fashion, I go over the issue several times and I tighten up the dialogue and panel descriptions and cut out and or change anything that might mess with the pace of the book. I will wait until the next day to come back and read the script with fresh eyes. I try to add a reason of some sort to make the reader want to turn each page, be it an unfinished line of dialogue or an incomplete action that the reader has to turn the page to see. This is something unique to writing comics that is not necessary in prose. This is called hitting the beats in the comic business. Once I have done everything I can to make the comic script the best I can make it and as close to edited as I can get it, then I turn it over to Russ Pirozek to edit. Steve has been gracious enough to read my comic scripts and offer some polishing advice for the last couple of comics I have written, and I have found his input to be invaluable. And that's the last thing I wanted to point out. So while you can't share your story with everyone and expect it to sell and make the story before someone else does, you will need a trusted few to read your work before you hand it over to the artist and the letterer. This is crucial. I can tell you how easy it is to miss things said wrong or described wrong or not see a flaw in the pacing when it's just you looking at it. Without other perspectives on what you've written, it's hard to know how it will be taken. You could totally hear a line differently in your head than it comes across when it's read. You can also totally think you have described a panel clearly and it just doesn't read well and is thus unclear. So yeah, that is the basics of how I script a comic.
I totally get what you're saying because a lot of the time I tend to skip words, so I totally get you. But I tend to use some of those techniques that you mentioned, so I don't have a ton to add on this point. I generally agree that you want to be very careful because of how many words you drop into each channel. The more burger standard is a pretty good one, and I've seen modern creators use something similar. I'll very often do a pass after my first draft and figure out how much verbiage I need to cut. While I like reading Claremont style comics, I really don't think that approach works now. I think it's important to say more with less whenever that's possible. But it's also a question of planning out your panels on the page so that they convey what you need to visually. It's possible to say what you need in your panel descriptions and let your artist do the work so that you don't have to say as much in your dialogue or narration. So I like to give the artist the real estate and add what the story needs to add, the things that the art alone can't tell you. Just remember that comics is a visual medium, and you should ideally want to strike the right balance between the story and the art.
Well said, Steve. I have heard people say that it is all about the art, and they even complain about the reading. But I don't agree with that. I also think that the medium is not fully being realized in a strictly literary sense. As you said so well, Steve, the key is finding that perfect balance. From two comic book writers to another, we want to say thanks for listening, and we hope that this was helpful on some level to those who might be starting out in this business. I was personally mentored by a pro in the business when I started out, and I believe in both paying it forward, and I genuinely want you to succeed at making comics. And I believe that my friend Steve does as well. So until next time, remember that according to Wayne Gretzky, you miss every shot that you don't take. Thank you to our patrons who make this podcast possible.